How does a man who performs puppet shows for children become one of Philadelphia's most notorious serial killers? What drives someone to sleep peacefully above the bodies of their victims? When children gathered to laugh at his Cookie Monster puppet, did anyone suspect the horror that lay just steps away? Behind boarded windows and locked doors, Harrison Graham was hiding more than just his Cookie Monster. He was concealing 7 brutal murders. What twisted logic allows a killer to entertain children by day while collecting corpses by night? The summer of 1987 hung heavy over Philadelphia, a thick blanket of heat wrapping around the city like a suffocating embrace. In a rundown neighborhood where hope seemed as scarce as working streetlights, an old apartment building stood as a silent witness to the darkness that lived within its walls. On August 9th, as storm clouds gathered overhead promising relief from the oppressive heat, residents of 1631 North 19th Street noticed something was different about their neighbor, Harrison Graham. The 28-year-old man, known throughout the neighborhood for his constant companion, a Cookie Monster puppet he carried everywhere, was acting stranger than usual. Children who once laughed at his silly impersonations of the beloved Sesame Street character now watched from behind curtained windows as he frantically moved about his third-floor apartment. The building itself was a testament to urban decay, windows boarded up, hallways littered with debris, and an overwhelming sense of despair that seemed to seep from its very walls. But even in this place where the unusual was commonplace, something about Harrison Graham's apartment had been bothering his neighbors for weeks. It was the smell, a horrific, indescribable odor that grew stronger with each passing day of the summer heat. When the landlord finally demanded to inspect the apartment, Harrison's response was telling. Instead of complying, he nailed his door shut in a desperate act of defiance. Then, clutching his beloved Cookie Monster puppet, a bottle of water, and a handful of clothes, he disappeared down the fire escape like a shadow fleeing from the light. The police who arrived at the scene that day were already on edge. The city was still reeling from the recent capture of Gary Heidnik, another killer who had terrorized Philadelphia from just a few miles away. Simultaneously, the investigation into the mysterious Frankfurt slasher remained open, with a killer still at large in the very same neighborhood. Officer Pete Scatino, a veteran familiar with the area's darker side, approached the building with the weight of experience heavy on his shoulders. The moment they broke through Harrison's nailed-shut door, the truth hit them like a physical force. The smell, which had been bad in the hallway, became an overwhelming assault on their senses. In the dim light filtering through boarded windows, they found themselves standing in what could only be described as a nightmare made real. The apartment was a maze of horror. Waist-high piles of trash created twisted corridors through the darkness. Rotting food containers, newspapers yellowed with age, and piles of dirty clothes created a landscape of decay. But it was what lay beneath this chaos that would shake even the most hardened officers to their core. On the wall, a disturbing drawing of a naked woman had been defaced with crude language, the markings appearing to have been made with dried blood. The real horror lay behind a door marked with the name Marty. Through its keyhole, Officer Scatino made the first of what would become many grim discoveries. The unmistakable sight of a woman's legs, unnaturally still in the darkness. The subsequent investigation would reveal a truth more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Harrison Graham, the man who made children laugh with his puppet shows, had transformed his apartment into a house of horrors. As thunder rolled overhead and the promised storm finally broke, Philadelphia's law enforcement faced a chilling reality. They weren't just dealing with another tragic death in a neighborhood all too familiar with tragedy. They were standing at the threshold of what would become one of the city's most disturbing crime scenes. A place where the line between eccentric neighbor and monster had blurred into something almost incomprehensible. The Cookie Monster killer, as he would come to be known, had left behind a legacy of horror that would haunt the city for years to come. Like a scene from a nightmare, each layer of discovery revealed new horrors that tested the resolve of even the most seasoned detectives. Officer Pete Scatino and investigator Charles Johnson led the initial search. The third floor of the building was a maze of decay, with most windows boarded up and no working electricity. The darkness seemed alive, hiding secrets in its shadows. Their flashlight beams cut through the gloom, revealing walls covered in disturbing graffiti and crude drawings. The air was so thick with the stench of death that both men had to fight the urge to retreat. Behind the door marked Marty, they made their first horrific discovery: 2 bodies on a filthy mattress. One woman lay twisted unnaturally, her skin discolored and bloated from decomposition. Next to her, another victim was found wearing a distinctive t-shirt with Petiot and a red rose design. Both were in their late 20s or early 30s, and both had been dead for only a few days in the summer heat. As more officers arrived with additional lighting and equipment, the true scope of Harrison's crimes began to emerge. Beneath mountains of garbage, newspapers, and rotting food, they found a third body wrapped in sheets. This victim was nearly skeletal, suggesting she had been there for months. The scattered fragments of her clothing were the only clues to her identity. By 3:45 p.m., Detective James Hansen, fresh from closing the Heidnik case, arrived to supervise. His experience noted disturbing similarities to other cases, but this was something different. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a tomb where a killer had lived among his victims. As the team cleared debris to photograph and document their findings, a fourth set of remains emerged. Each discovery brought new challenges. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, creating a timeline of death that stretched back months. The small apartment had become a makeshift cemetery, with victims buried under layers of trash and forgotten belongings. The most disturbing discovery came at 5:30 p.m., a fifth body wedged between 2 mattresses. The realization that Harrison had been sleeping on top of one of his victims sent shudders through the investigation team. The body was so decomposed that determining gender was initially impossible. This wasn't just murder. It was a display of complete disconnection from humanity. The search continued into the evening as storm clouds gathered. In a tiny closet just 6 inches deep, they found a 6th victim, bound with white electrical cord and wrapped in a sheet. The methodical way the body had been stored suggested a disturbing level of planning and organization. As night fell and rain began to pour, news of the discoveries spread through the neighborhood. Crowds gathered outside, watching in horror as body bag after body bag was carried out by masked officers. The building, already a symbol of urban decay, had become a monument to evil. The final horror awaited them on the roof. Unlike the other victims, the 7th body was found dismembered, hidden beneath a stained mattress in a decaying canvas bag. The head and torso were missing, leading investigators to search the surrounding area, including vacant lots where Harrison had been seen digging. In total, 7 women had met their end in this house of horrors. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of a killer who had lived among his victims, carrying on his daily life surrounded by death. The Cookie Monster puppet he had left behind seemed to mock the investigators, a children's toy in a place of ultimate darkness. As the investigation continued, the building was condemned. The remaining tenants were evacuated, leaving behind a place that would forever be marked by the darkness that had lived within its walls. For the investigators, the case was just beginning. For Philadelphia, it was another chapter in a dark period that had seen multiple serial killers operating within miles of each other. Just months after capturing Gary Heidnik, and with the Frankfurt slasher still at large, another monster had emerged from their streets. The manhunt for Harrison Graham would test not only the police department's resources but also reveal the complex bonds of family and community. The search began immediately after Officer Pete Scatino made his grim discovery. Police plastered Harrison's photo across the city. A tall, lean man with distant eyes, known for carrying a Cookie Monster puppet. Local newspapers ran dramatic headlines: Cookie Monster killer flees, 7 bodies found in North Philadelphia apartment, manhunt underway for puppet-carrying killer. The city buzzed with sightings. A waitress at an all-night diner claimed she served him coffee. A bus driver was certain he'd ridden the Broad Street line. Each report sent tactical teams rushing across Philadelphia, only to find they were minutes too late. The closest call came at the Cathedral of Deliverance Evangelistic Church, where witnesses described seeing a man matching Harrison's description getting a meal. He appeared vacant, they said, with glassy eyes and dirty clothes. Police arrived moments after he'd slipped away. Meanwhile, the investigation team worked to understand their quarry. They interviewed Harrison's mother, Lillian Graham Jeter, learning that her son had been diagnosed with mental health issues at age 12 and spent 2 years in a hospital. He'd struggled with drug addiction, particularly crack cocaine, which had forced her to kick him out of her home in 1979 when he was just 20 years old. The community's response was mixed. Some neighbors described Harrison as quiet and friendly, often doing handyman work around the area. Others recalled disturbing incidents, his conversations with the puppet, dancing alone in the streets, sudden mood swings. Children who had once laughed at his Cookie Monster impressions now had nightmares about the puppet. Day after day, as forensics teams continued their work at the apartment, the media coverage intensified. Local TV stations ran special reports about mental illness and drug addiction. Crime experts speculated about possible connections to other unsolved murders. The puppet angle particularly captivated the public's imagination, turning Harrison into a sort of urban boogeyman. Harrison's siblings joined their mother in making public appeals. "Stop running, son," Lillian pleaded during one emotional television appearance. "Whatever happened, we can work this out. Your family loves you." Their words seemed to float through the city, hoping to reach wherever Harrison was hiding. Finally, on August 17th, 8 days after the first bodies were discovered, Lillian's phone rang. It was Harrison, his voice tired and hungry. Mother's instinct told her this was her chance. She kept her voice steady, loving, as they talked about simple things. Was he eating? Did he need clean clothes? When he asked if she could bring him some food, she agreed immediately, arranging to meet at a street corner just blocks from his old apartment. As soon as she hung up, Lillian contacted the police. Officers Ed Spangler and Larry Bickey were chosen for the delicate task of making the arrest. They positioned themselves carefully, knowing they couldn't risk spooking Harrison and losing him again. When he appeared, walking slowly toward his mother, there was no dramatic chase, no violent confrontation. The Cookie Monster killer surrendered quietly, his puppet conspicuously absent. Back at the police station, as Harrison was processed and charged, his mother watched with tears in her eyes. The manhunt was over, but for the families of his victims, for the investigators piecing together his crimes, and for a city still struggling to understand how such evil could hide behind something as innocent as a children's puppet, the story was far from finished. To understand how Harrison Graham became the Cookie Monster killer, we must travel back through his troubled history, examining what shaped a handyman with a puppet into one of Philadelphia's most disturbing murderers. Born to a 17-year-old mother, Harrison's early life was marked by instability and confusion. Lillian Graham Jeter, despite her youth, tried her best to raise her eldest son in a loving environment. But from an early age, something was different about Harrison. He struggled to form relationships with other children, preferring to spend time alone, lost in his own world. At age 12, a pivotal moment occurred that would shape his future. Harrison was diagnosed with a mental disorder severe enough to require hospitalization. For 2 years, he lived in an institutional setting, separated from his family and struggling to understand his own mind. The specific diagnosis remained unclear, but the impact was profound. When he returned home, he was a changed person, carrying invisible scars that would never fully heal. The streets of Philadelphia became his escape. There, at a young age, he found what he believed was love from a male pimp who introduced him to both drugs and prostitution. This confusing relationship, part exploitation, part acceptance, created deep conflicts within Harrison about his sexuality, his faith, and his place in the world. His mother eventually managed to pull him away from street life, but the damage was done. Harrison's drug use, particularly crack cocaine, escalated to the point where Lillian had no choice but to force him out of her home in 1979. He was just 20 years old, mentally ill, addicted, and now homeless. It was during this period that Harrison acquired his trademark Cookie Monster puppet. What began as a simple toy became his constant companion, a buffer between him and a world he struggled to understand. Local children would gather to watch him perform with the puppet, his Cookie Monster voice bringing smiles to their faces. But behind this seemingly innocent facade, darker impulses were growing. Harrison found work as a handyman, showing surprising skill at fixing things despite his mental challenges. He moved into the apartment at 1631 North 19th Street, a building as broken as he was. His neighbors knew him as two different people: the quiet handyman who could fix anything, and the eccentric man who held conversations with his puppet while dancing alone in the streets. His apartment became a gathering place for drug users and sex workers, people living on society's margins like himself. Harrison developed a reputation for dealing drugs, but also for unpredictable behavior. Some women reported feeling uncomfortable around him, sensing something threatening beneath his childlike facade with the puppet. The contrast in his personality became more pronounced over time. He could be gentle and helpful one moment, violent and threatening the next. He began keeping notebooks filled with disturbing drawings, naked women, dismembered body parts, crude sexual imagery. A neighbor once witnessed him dangling a woman out of his window, her screams piercing the night before he pulled her back inside. Religious conflict tormented him. Harrison viewed himself as a Christian, yet struggled with what he saw as sinful aspects of his life: his drug use, his sexuality, his dark impulses. This internal battle manifested in the creation of multiple personalities: Marty, the friendly handyman; Junior, the childlike Christian; and Frank, the violent drug addict who hated women. Whether these personalities were genuine manifestations of mental illness or convenient explanations for his actions would later become a matter of legal debate. What was clear was that Harrison Graham was a man at war with himself, his demons eventually manifesting in acts of unthinkable violence. The Cookie Monster puppet, which had started as a source of innocent entertainment, became a symbol of his fractured psyche. Through it, he expressed a part of himself that could still connect with others, while hiding the darkness that was growing within him. The puppet was both his mask to the world and his confession, a bright blue reminder that monsters can hide behind the most innocent of faces. 7 women lost their lives at the hands of Harrison Graham, each of their stories representing more than just a statistic in Philadelphia's crime records. These were daughters, sisters, mothers, women with hopes, dreams, and families who loved them. Robin Deschizer, 29, was the first to fall victim to Graham's violence. A former girlfriend who knew about Marty, she met her end in January 1987. Friends described her as vivacious and street smart, someone who could light up a room with her smile. Her mother, Amelia Deschizer, would later weep outside the courtroom, saying, "I guess justice was done, but I still hate him." Robin's remains were found dismembered, scattered between the apartment roof and a nearby basement, a testament to the killer's growing depravity. Mary Jeter Matthews, 36, was a mother of 5 whose absence left a gaping hole in her family's life. Her husband recognized her by the distinctive shirt he had bought her, a cruel detail that brought both closure and fresh pain. Mary had gone to buy drugs from Graham, a decision that tragically led to her death. Her children would grow up without their mother's love, their lives forever altered by one fatal choice. Sandra Garvin, 33, had a roommate who feared the worst when she didn't return from Graham's apartment. A regular in the neighborhood, Sandra was known for her kindness to others despite her own struggles with addiction. Her father, Leroy Artis, spoke of his devastating loss. "This has been one of the most excruciating phases of my life, just having to go there and sitting through it. I guess time heals all things." Cynthia Brooks, 27, worked odd jobs to support herself, dreaming of a better life. Those who knew her spoke of her determination to overcome her addiction, of plans to return to school. Her brother maintained a vigil outside the courthouse throughout Graham's trial, holding a photo of Cynthia in happier times. Barbara Mahoney, 22, was the youngest victim. A talented artist who sketched portraits on the street for tourists, she had moved to Philadelphia with dreams of attending art school. Her sketchbook, found among her belongings, showed the promise of a creative life cut brutally short. Patricia Franklin, 24, came from a close-knit family that never stopped searching for her. Her sister posted flyers throughout the neighborhood, refusing to give up hope even as weeks turned into months. The discovery of her body brought an end to their search, but not to their pain. The final victim identified was Valerie Jameson, 25, whose unique physical features helped forensic sculptor Frank Bender create a lifelike reconstruction of her face. Her parents recognized her from the bust, their worst fears confirmed by a distinctive rib feature that matched their daughter's medical records. She had been missing for 6 months, her family living in desperate hope until the devastating identification. The identification process itself was a testament to the dedication of law enforcement and forensic experts. The medical examiner team, led by Robert L. Catherman, faced the challenging task of identifying bodies in various states of decomposition. They employed every available technique, dental records, personal effects, distinctive clothing, and in Valerie's case, the artistic skills of Frank Bender. The victims shared common threads in their stories: struggles with addiction, connections to the neighborhood, and fatal encounters with a man who masked his darkness behind a puppet's innocent face. Yet each was unique, with their own dreams, personalities, and loved ones left behind to mourn. Dr. Haskell Eskin, the forensic dentist, worked tirelessly to match dental records as families came forward with hopes and fears about their missing loved ones. 5 of the victims had undergone dental work, providing crucial evidence for identification. For the families, these confirmations brought a brutal mix of closure and renewed grief. The impact on the community was profound. In a neighborhood already struggling with poverty and addiction, the murders highlighted the vulnerability of women living on society's margins. Local organizations organized vigils, support groups formed for families of victims, and discussions began about better protecting at-risk women. Churches in the area held memorial services, remembering not just how these women died, but how they lived. Stories emerged of their kindness, their struggles, their humanity. At one service, Robin's mother spoke of her daughter's dream of opening a shelter for homeless women, a dream that would never be realized. Personal items found with the bodies told silent stories of lives in progress: Barbara's sketchbook, Mary's distinctive shirt, Valerie's earrings. These belongings, carefully cataloged by investigators, served both to identify the victims and to remind everyone that these were real women with real lives, not just names in a police report. The investigation of Harrison Graham's crimes began in the stifling heat of August 1987, unfolding into one of Philadelphia's most complex and disturbing cases. The city's police department, already stretched thin by 2 other active serial killer investigations, would find themselves facing challenges that would test both their professional skills and emotional resilience. Detective James Hansen led the investigation, having just wrapped up the Heidnik case. His experience with serial killers would prove invaluable as he pieced together the puzzle of Harrison Graham's crimes. The initial crime scene at 1631 North 19th Street presented unique challenges. With no electricity and most windows boarded up, investigators worked in near darkness, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom to reveal horror after horror. The forensics team, led by medical examiner Robert L. Catherman, faced the daunting task of processing a crime scene contaminated by years of accumulated garbage. Each piece of trash had to be carefully sorted and documented, as potential evidence could be hidden anywhere. They photographed everything, creating a meticulous record of the apartment's condition. Evidence collection proved particularly challenging due to the various states of decomposition. The 2 most recent victims, found on the mattress, provided the most useful forensic evidence. Their bodies, though degraded by the summer heat, still retained crucial clues. The discovery of a broken hyoid bone in one victim confirmed strangulation as the cause of death, a pattern that would emerge across multiple victims. The investigation took an unexpected turn when officers discovered the dismembered remains on the roof. This showed a different level of violence, suggesting an escalation in Graham's behavior. The search expanded to neighboring buildings, leading to the discovery of more remains in a nearby basement. The electrical cord used to bind some victims became a signature element, helping link the crimes together. Detective Hansen employed a methodical approach to building the case. He interviewed dozens of neighbors, piecing together Graham's daily routines and behaviors. The Cookie Monster puppet emerged as a crucial element in understanding the killer's psychology. Witnesses described Graham's interactions with the puppet, his use of it to entertain children, and his habit of holding conversations with it in the puppet's voice. The investigation also revealed Graham's drug connections. His apartment had served as a known drug den, complicating the investigation as potential witnesses feared coming forward. However, this aspect of his life provided valuable leads, as several victims had connections to the local drug scene. Forensic dentist Haskell Eskin played a crucial role in victim identification. His work with dental records helped confirm the identities of 5 victims, providing closure to searching families. The involvement of forensic sculptor Frank Bender proved particularly valuable in identifying Valerie Jameson, demonstrating the importance of artistic skills in modern criminal investigation. The discovery of Graham's notebooks filled with disturbing drawings provided insight into his mental state. Crime scene photographers documented pages showing crude sketches of naked women and dismembered body parts. These drawings, along with witness accounts of his behavior, helped build a psychological profile of the killer. Investigators also explored possible connections to other active cases. While Graham operated in the same area as the Frankfurt slasher and not far from where Heidnik had committed his crimes, distinct differences in methodology and victim selection helped investigators determine these were separate killers. This realization added to the growing concern about the number of active serial killers in Philadelphia at the time. The police department's evidence lab processed hundreds of items from the apartment. Personal effects found with the body's jewelry, clothing, personal items were carefully cataloged and photographed. These items would prove crucial in both identifying victims and building the case against Graham. Detective Hansen's interrogation of Graham after his arrest revealed both challenges and breakthroughs. Graham's initial claim that the bodies had been in the apartment when he moved in 4 years ago quickly fell apart under questioning. As Hansen pressed, Graham's story evolved, eventually leading to his confession to all 7 murders. The investigation had to carefully document Graham's mental state throughout the process. His claims about multiple personalities, Marty, Jr., and Frank, required evaluation by mental health professionals. The team had to determine whether these were genuine manifestations of mental illness or an attempt to avoid responsibility. The role of Graham's mother proved crucial to both the investigation and eventual prosecution. Her statements about his mental health history, including his hospitalization at age 12, helped build a complete picture of the killer's background. Her cooperation, while painful for her as a mother, provided valuable context for understanding Graham's development into a killer. Investigators also worked to understand the significance of the name Marty, carved into the door of Graham's makeshift tomb. This detail, along with Graham's later claims about his multiple personalities, added psychological complexity to the case. The team consulted with psychiatrists to understand how Graham's mental illness might have influenced his crimes. The investigation faced additional challenges from the building's condition. The structure was condemned during the investigation, forcing teams to work quickly to gather evidence before the site became too dangerous. The discovery of bones in the garden area required careful excavation, though these ultimately proved to be from dogs rather than human victims. Media attention complicated the investigation. While publicity helped generate leads, it also created pressure on the investigation team. They had to balance public safety concerns with the integrity of their investigation, carefully controlling what information was released to the press. Throughout the investigation, detectives maintained close contact with victims' families. Regular briefings kept them informed of progress while gathering additional information about the victims' last known movements. This communication proved vital in both solving the crimes and helping families cope with their losses. The investigation's thoroughness would prove crucial during the legal proceedings. Every piece of evidence was documented and preserved according to proper procedure, every witness statement carefully recorded, every detail of Graham's confession noted. This attention to detail would help ensure that Graham would face justice for his crimes. The case changed how Philadelphia police approached complex crime scenes. New protocols were developed for processing locations with multiple victims, and the department strengthened its relationships with forensic specialists. The investigation demonstrated the value of a multidisciplinary approach, combining traditional police work with forensic science and psychological analysis. In the quiet interrogation room of the Philadelphia Police Department, Harrison Graham began to tell his story. After 8 days on the run, exhausted and hungry, he was finally ready to talk. Detective James Hansen, who had pursued Graham through the streets of Philadelphia, sat across from him. The detective had just wrapped up the Heidnik case and recognized something familiar in Graham's eyes. The look of a man carrying dark secrets. Graham's mother, Lillian, insisted on being present during questioning, her presence both a comfort to her son and a witness to what was to come. Initially, Graham's story seemed absurd. He claimed the bodies had been in the apartment when he moved in 4 years ago. As Detective Hansen pressed gently but firmly, pointing out inconsistencies, the truth began to emerge. Hour by hour, Graham's facade cracked, revealing the horror beneath. The first admission came almost casually. "Yes," he said, "I killed the last 2, but Hansen knew there was more." As the interrogation continued, Graham's story expanded. He began to speak about Marty, a personality he claimed lived inside him. According to Graham, while his hands had done the killing, Marty was responsible. The most chilling aspect of Graham's confession was his description of the first murder. Robin Deschazer, a former girlfriend, knew about Marty and his desires. Graham explained, "I didn't want her looking at me that way, and I seen God being angry through her eyes. After killing her, he was so disturbed that he left her body in the apartment. It wasn't until he brought another woman home that he tried to hide the remains, moving them to the roof." As Graham continued to confess, a pattern emerged in his methodology. He would lure victims to his apartment by offering drugs. What began as consensual encounters would end in strangulation. Graham claimed to be shocked each time he woke to find a victim dead beside him, yet he continued to bring women to his apartment. The confession took a strange turn when Graham began discussing his multiple personalities. Beyond Marty, he spoke of Junior, a childlike Christian personality who loved his mother, and Frank, a homosexual streetwise drug addict who he claimed was responsible for the murders. Whether these personalities were real or fabricated for legal purposes would become a matter of intense debate. Throughout the interrogation, Graham displayed an unexpected artistic ability, sketching detailed portraits of his victims. The drawings showed a talent that surprised the detectives, who had expected the mentally disabled man to struggle with such tasks. He was also more articulate than anticipated, able to describe his crimes in clear, sometimes poetic language. His mother watched in horror as her son detailed each murder. She had raised him in the church, tried to guide him away from the streets, but now sat listening to him describe unthinkable acts. Yet she remained, providing both support for her son and crucial context for the investigators about his mental health history. Over several sessions, Graham produced a 10-page written confession. The document detailed every murder, though he consistently maintained they were accidents that occurred during sex. His writing revealed a man struggling with his actions, repeatedly insisting that the deaths were unintentional while providing details that suggested otherwise. The confession included descriptions of what he did with the bodies. He explained how he would wrap them in sheets, bind them with electrical cord, and conceal them within his apartment. He lived among his victims, sleeping on a mattress that concealed a decomposing body, carrying on his daily life surrounded by death. Detective Hansen noted how Graham's demeanor changed when discussing his victims. He showed genuine remorse at times, yet could also be disturbingly detached. When shown crime scene photos, he dismissed them as the actions of a very sick person, sometimes even chuckling at the images. The role of the Cookie Monster puppet emerged in his confession. Graham explained how the puppet helped him feel normal, allowed him to connect with others, particularly children in the neighborhood. The contrast between this seemingly innocent aspect of his life and his brutal crimes highlighted the complexity of his psychological state. Court-appointed psychologists evaluated Graham throughout the confession process. They found him to be calm, alert, and cooperative, though they identified several personality disorders. None believed these disorders would make him incapable of standing trial, despite his claims about multiple personalities. Graham's confession raised questions about potential additional victims. When asked directly, he maintained there were only 7, but investigators noted patterns in his behavior that suggested there might be more. The assistant district attorney told reporters the books might not be closed. Throughout the confession, Graham maintained an almost childlike demeanor, often asking about his Cookie Monster puppet and appearing confused about the gravity of his situation. Yet his detailed recollection of the murders and artistic recreation of his victims' faces showed a clarity that contradicted this appearance. Details emerged about his relationships with some victims. Mary Matthews, he claimed, was pregnant with his child, though this was later proved false. He spoke of Sandra Garvin as someone he had known for years through the neighborhood drug scene. Each victim had a connection to him, however brief, before their deaths. The confession process was complicated by Graham's drug use. He admitted to being high during many of the murders, using crack cocaine heavily throughout the period. This raised questions about the reliability of his memories and his state of mind during the crimes. Graham's lawyer, Joel Moldovsky, would later challenge the confession's validity, arguing that his client's mental state and the lengthy interrogation made it inadmissible. However, the detail and consistency of Graham's account, along with the physical evidence, made the confession powerful evidence. The legal case against Harrison Graham began with a fundamental question. Was a man who carried conversations with a Cookie Monster puppet mentally fit to stand trial? The pre-trial hearings opened in Philadelphia's criminal court with this crucial debate. Harrison's defense attorney, Joel Moldovsky, argued passionately that his client was not competent. He presented expert witnesses, including psychologist Dr. Stanton, who testified that Harrison had an IQ of 63, below the threshold for legal competency. According to Dr. Stanton's evaluation, Harrison suffered from hallucinations, psychosis, blackouts, and chronic paranoia. Dr. Albert Levitt, another defense expert, testified that Harrison lacked basic academic skills like reading, writing, math, and telling time. However, Judge Edward McKell found this testimony at odds with the coherent, detailed confession Harrison had provided to detectives. The judge relied heavily on the prosecution's expert, Dr. Robert Sard, who maintained that Harrison had been fully aware and competent during his interrogation. In October, Harrison entered a not guilty plea in a manner that seemed to support his lawyer's concerns about his mental state. When Judge McKell asked if he understood what was happening, Harrison simply replied, "Nope." He claimed not to know where he was and said he just wanted to go home. Assistant District Attorney Roger King suggested Harrison was merely pretending to be confused. The evidence hearing brought the horror of Graham's crimes into stark focus. Over 100 graphic crime scene photos were introduced into evidence. When these were displayed, Harrison's behavior was puzzling. He dismissed them as the actions of a very sick person, while sometimes chuckling at the images. The medical examiner investigator, Charles Johnson, methodically presented each photograph, with Judge Robert Latrone stepping down from the bench to examine them closely. The trial took an unexpected turn when Paula, a former girlfriend, took the stand. She testified about living with Harrison for 3 years, during which he regularly strangled her during sex, sometimes until she lost consciousness. According to Paula, Harrison had admitted to killing Robin Deschizer because she planned to leave him. Even more disturbing, she claimed he had confessed to practicing necrophilia with the corpse. This testimony triggered an outburst from Harrison, who accused Paula of lying. The defense quickly challenged her credibility, noting that her account of Robin's death contradicted the physical evidence. She claimed strangulation while evidence suggested beating. Mary Hogan, who had previously shared her story anonymously with the press, provided another dramatic moment in court. She described discovering Robin's body on the roof months before the police investigation began. When she tried to escape with her belongings, she testified that Harrison threatened her with a machete and locked her in the apartment. Though she eventually got away and reported the body to police, her report was never investigated, a failing that would haunt the department. Throughout the proceedings, Harrison's behavior was erratic. He brought 4 monkey puppets to court one day, playing with them while his defense presented arguments. He giggled inappropriately when evidence about dismembered remains was discussed. His demeanor seemed to swing between childlike confusion and inappropriate cheerfulness. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney King, methodically built their case. They presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Harrison's own confession. King argued that the consistent pattern of strangulation showed premeditation rather than accident, and that Harrison's efforts to hide the bodies demonstrated his awareness of guilt. Defense attorney Moldavsky pursued three alternative theories: that the women had died from drug overdoses, that someone else, possibly the landlord, had committed the murders, or that Harrison's severe mental illness and drug use had led to accidental deaths during sex. He particularly emphasized Harrison's documented history of mental health issues and his mother's testimony about his childhood hospitalization. The decision to waive a jury trial proved crucial. With Judge Latrone already familiar with much of the evidence, the trial proceeded more quickly than anticipated. The judge had to weigh not only the evidence but also the complex questions about Harrison's mental state and legal responsibility. Despite maintaining his innocence, Harrison was found guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of corpse charges for all 7 victims. As the verdict was read, he merely blinked, shook his head, and remarked, "Everything will work out just fine." His only request was for the return of his Cookie Monster puppet, which was no longer needed as evidence. The sentencing phase brought another surprising turn. Judge Latrone imposed 6 death sentences but ordered that they not be carried out until after Harrison served a life sentence. This unprecedented decision effectively meant Harrison would serve life without parole instead of facing immediate execution. The judge cited Harrison's neglected childhood and lack of prior criminal convictions as mitigating factors. The victims' families reacted differently to the sentence. Amelia Deschazer, Robin's mother, told reporters, "I guess justice was done. I still hate him." Leroy Artis, Sandra Garvin's father, expressed hope that time would help heal his family's wounds. The legal proceedings concluded with a strange mix of justice served and questions unresolved. While Harrison was convicted of all charges, debates about his mental state and true responsibility for his actions would continue through years of appeals. In later years, as attitudes toward executing mentally ill defendants evolved, Harrison's case would return to court. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court banned the execution of what it termed the mentally retarded. By December 2003, Harrison was deemed incompetent for execution. His death sentences were vacated, and his life sentence was reinstated. Today, at age 65, Harrison Graham serves as a minister in prison, his Cookie Monster puppet long gone, but the questions about his mental state and the nature of his crimes continuing to intrigue and disturb those who study the case. Paris, 1944. As war raged across Europe, a different kind of evil lurked behind the elegant facade of 21 Rue Le Soeur. The morning calm shattered when neighbors noticed thick black smoke pouring from a townhouse chimney. The smell was unmistakable and unforgettable. What firefighters discovered inside would expose the darkest secret of occupied Paris. In the basement, a human arm protruded from a coal stove, its flesh still burning. Charred bones littered the floor, mixed with coal and ash. Throughout the house, investigators found a nightmare. Dismembered body parts scattered across rooms, hastily hidden but telling a story of methodical murder. A respected figure had turned his basement into a killing chamber. In a time when desperate souls sought escape from Nazi persecution, at least 27 people walked through his door seeking salvation. None walked out. The true number of victims remains unknown to this day. Was it 30, 50, 63? Even after his capture, the killer played games with investigators, alternating between boastful confessions and cunning denials. But in his basement lay the gruesome evidence that would earn him a chilling nickname, the Butcher of Paris. For 2 years, while the Nazis patrolled the streets above, how did no one notice the horror below? And how did a man trusted by society transform into one of France's most prolific serial killers? The answers would reveal a story of betrayal so shocking it would haunt Paris for generations. Dr. Marcel André Henri Félix Petiot was born on a chilly day, January 17, 1897, in a small town in northern France. His parents, Félix and Marie, worked as postal workers. From a very young age, Marcel was different. He was incredibly smart, so smart that by the time he was just 5 years old, He could read books that were too hard for most kids his age. But there was something dark about him too. He often played alone and had a strange habit of hurting little creatures like insects and animals, just for fun. As he grew older, Marcel's behavior became even more frightening. At only 11 years old, he started sharing inappropriate pictures with his classmates and even made a classmate uncomfortable with his strange advances. He seemed to enjoy shocking everyone around him. One day, he took his father's gun and shot it into the ceiling of the classroom, thinking it would make the boring lesson more exciting. He also liked to throw knives at his classmates who stood against a door, but somehow no one ever got hurt. Worried about their son's troubling actions, Marcel's parents decided to take him to see a doctor. They told the doctor that Marcel had strange fits and sometimes walked in his sleep. They were also worried because he still wet the bed. They feared that their son's odd behavior was more serious than just childish pranks. Little did they know that this was just the beginning of a chilling story involving a man who would become known as one of France's most notorious serial killers during a time of great chaos in World War II. In 1912, a terrible event shook Petiot's world when his mother passed away. This loss forced his father to take a job far away, about 15 miles from their home in Ussur. Petiot and his brother Maurice were sent to live with their aunt, but things didn't improve. After Petiot was expelled from school for his bad behavior, he returned to live with his father. Unfortunately, he was expelled again from the local school because he just couldn't control himself. This cycle of trouble continued as Petiot grew into a more aggressive teenager. At just 17 years old, Petiot crossed a serious line when he robbed a postbox, stealing mail that he probably planned to use for blackmail. He was charged with stealing mail and damaging public property. When he appeared in court on March 26, 1914, a psychiatrist examined him and decided that Petiot was an unusual young man with deep personal problems that made it hard for him to understand the wrongness of his actions. The judge agreed and declared him mentally unfit to stand trial, which meant the charges were dropped. After being kicked out of at least 2 more schools for stealing, something called kleptomania, where someone feels an uncontrollable urge to steal, Petiot's father grew more worried about his son's future. In a last attempt to help him, he sent Petiot to a special academy in Paris. Finally, in 1915, Petiot graduated. Like many young men in France during that time, he joined the French army when he turned 18. By January 1916, he found himself fighting on the front lines of World War I. During one fierce battle, he was gassed and injured by grenade shrapnel, which pushed him into a complete mental breakdown. After this, Petiot was sent to different rest homes and mental health facilities. But even there, he couldn't stop himself from stealing, taking military blankets, morphine, wallets, photographs, and personal letters from other patients. Petiot found himself in jail in Oran, but soon he was moved to a military psychiatric unit in Flab for observation. While he was there, he watched the other patients closely, learning how to act like them and pretend to be suffering. A doctor diagnosed him with several mental issues, including mental imbalance, depression, and various fears. They decided that he wasn't legally responsible for all the things he had stolen. Despite this diagnosis, Petiot was sent back to the front lines in June 1918. Just 3 weeks later, he had another breakdown and reportedly shot himself in the foot with his own gun. Still, he was placed in a new regiment. After complaining of terrible headaches, he returned to the hospital once more. He spent a whole year in mental institutions, where he suffered from multiple seizures that made him bite his own tongue, leaving painful scars. Eventually, the French army discharged Petiot and gave him a 40% disability pension, suggesting that he should stay in a psychiatric hospital. In 1920, they increased his pension to 100%, strongly recommending that he spend the rest of his life in care. But by then, Petiot was tired of being treated like a patient. He hated being told what to do and resented authority. Determined to take control of his life and gain power over others, Petiot decided to become a doctor. In response to the heavy loss of life during World War I, France created a fast-track education program for veterans, and Petiot jumped at the chance. Incredibly, he completed his medical studies in just 8 months. At the University of Paris, Petiot completed a 2-year internship at a mental hospital. On December 15, 1921, he proudly received his medical diploma, officially making him a doctor. This quick journey to becoming a physician raised eyebrows because it was unusually fast. Today, it can take over 10 years to become a licensed doctor with all the training needed. Despite his short training, Petiot took his diploma and moved to Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, a small village with about 4,000 people. He worked hard to promote his practice, boasting that he was younger and more modern than the other two doctors in town. His flyer boldly claimed, "Dr. Petiot is young, and only a young doctor can keep up to date on the latest methods." This clever marketing paid off. Soon, he was well respected in the community with many loyal patients. However, becoming Dr. Petiot didn't change his bad habits. He often stole from his patients during home visits, and his brother Maurice had to check his pockets before he left the house. This sneaky behavior became somewhat of an open secret in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, but everyone liked Petiot too much to confront him about it. He also started signing his patients up for government medical programs without telling them, allowing him to collect payments from both the government and his patients for every visit. Petiot saw nothing wrong with his actions, but the local doctors and pharmacists certainly did. Many doctors thought his self-promotion was inappropriate for a physician and believed he was taking advantage of his patients, despite what his flyers claimed. Pharmacists became worried about the huge amounts of dangerous drugs Petiot prescribed, often in massive doses. Petiot brushed off their concerns, insisting that pharmacists had no right to question a doctor and claiming that drug companies weakened their medications. One shocking incident happened when a local pharmacist refused to fill a prescription for a child that would have been deadly even for an adult. In a heartless response, Petiot coldly remarked that it would be better for the child to die, as it would only annoy its mother. Despite these alarming behaviors, Petiot's popularity in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne soared. He was known for treating poor patients for free and kept his practice open at night and on weekends. He even performed illegal abortions, which were against the law in France at that time. His charming personality and willingness to help made him a well-liked figure in town. Even after being kicked out by his landlord for stealing and getting caught numerous times, Petiot managed to escape serious trouble with the law by claiming he was a certified lunatic, insisting that he could not be convicted. Petiot was supposed to be re-evaluated by the military pension fund, but he boldly declared that he would rather give up any future payments than go through the humiliating assessment process again. Yet, the checks kept coming. Eventually, he had another evaluation in 1924, which resulted in his disability pension being cut down to 50%. In that same year, Petiot met a young woman named Louisette de Lavaux, who was 24 years old and the daughter of an elderly patient. Louisette quickly caught his eye, but there was a problem. She worked as a housekeeper. It was seen as inappropriate for a doctor to have a maid as a mistress, so they pretended she was working for him and she moved into his home. However, their relationship soon soured. In May 1926, Louisette confided in friends that she was pregnant and wanted to end the pregnancy because Petiot had been unfaithful. The very next day, she disappeared without a trace. Petiot claimed they had a fierce argument and that Louisette had stormed off, leaving all her belongings behind. Shortly after she vanished, villagers saw him loading a large trunk into the back of his car. Days later, townspeople over 100 miles away fished a suspicious trunk out of the water. Inside was the dismembered and decapitated body of a young woman in her early 20s. Although some locals suspected Petiot's involvement, the body was so badly mutilated that it couldn't be officially linked to him, and soon the case went cold. Police assumed Louisette had simply run away, just as Petiot had said. Feeling confident after seemingly escaping justice and enjoying his influence over the town, Petiot decided he could achieve more than just being a doctor. In 1926, he announced his run for mayor of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. He began his campaign with a shocking statement: "I must confess that I'm guilty of a very serious crime. I stand accused of loving the people too much." During this speech, he hired someone to cut the power to the auditorium just as his opponent was about to speak. This act ended up cutting power to the entire town and causing several fires, but it served its purpose. In July 1926, Petiot won the mayoral election in a landslide. Surprisingly, once in office, Petiot started taking city funds from the town clerk's desk for his own use. His position of power did nothing to stop his stealing habits. In 1927, Petiot met Garrett Valentine Law, the 23-year-old daughter of a respected landowner. They got married and welcomed their only child, Gerard, on April 19, 1928. Just 8 months later, Petiot faced accusations of stealing oil cans from the railroad depot. Although he had actually bought the cans, he committed fraud by claiming he never received them and asking for a refund. This led to a fine of 200 francs and a 3-month jail sentence. He was temporarily suspended as mayor for 4 months, but this punishment was later overturned on appeal. During this chaotic time, a tragic event shook the village. On March 11, 1930, Armand Duber, the owner of a local dairy cooperative, returned home to find his building engulfed in flames. Knowing his wife Andriette was inside, he rushed in only to discover her lifeless body on the kitchen floor, beaten and bloody as the fire raged around her. While firefighters battled the flames, Dr. Petiot and his wife drove past without stopping to help or offer condolences. They went on to enjoy an evening at the cinema. Investigators noted that the timing of the attack matched with Armand being away from home just before he was supposed to distribute payments to dairy farms. This led them to believe that the attacker must have known the family personally. The discovery of 20,000 francs missing from their home further supported their theory that it was a burglary gone wrong, suggesting that Andriette had been killed when she interrupted the thief. As soon as news of the tragedy spread, the locals were desperate to find someone to blame. The only person who seemed to fit the bill was their beloved mayor, Dr. Petiot. Rumors started flying, and Petiot even wrote an anonymous note that described the murder in such detail that investigators were both impressed and worried. When he became the only suspect who refused to give his fingerprints, their concerns grew even deeper. One secret witness began to feel uneasy after hearing whispers about an affair between Petiot and Armand's wife, Andriette. A local bistro owner felt he had to come forward about the night of the fire, recalling that he had seen Petiot near the house that evening. As more coincidences piled up, he gathered the courage to speak with the police. That night, while out for a drink, he ran into Dr. Petiot. During their chat, the bistro owner mentioned a pain he was having, and Petiot eagerly offered to help him. He led the witness back to his home, bragging about a new treatment that would cure him right away. Tragically, just 3 hours later, the man was dead from what Petiot claimed was an aneurysm, as noted on the death certificate. Petiot briefly reclaimed his position as mayor but soon faced more accusations of theft and financial misconduct. In August 1931, he announced his resignation. Despite all this chaos, he remained popular among his peers. In a show of support, the entire village council resigned in sympathy with him. Just 5 weeks later, he was elected as one of 34 general councilors in the Yonne district. However, his time in office was rocky and marked by accusations of stealing electricity from the village. In 1932, a judge dismissed Petiot's defense as nothing but pure fantasy and sentenced him to 15 days in jail. Furious about how he was treated and facing serious allegations of fraud, theft, corruption, and even murder, Petiot decided it was time to leave the area. He packed up his family and moved to Paris for a fresh start. Upon arriving in January 1933, Petiot quickly began promoting himself with a bunch of fake credentials to attract new patients. He handed out flyers at pharmacies, nightclubs, bars, and brothels, hoping to earn the same trust he had enjoyed back in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. These flyers claimed he could cure almost any illness, including diabetes, cancer, and gonorrhea. Outside his office at 66 Rue Martin in Paris's 9th arrondissement, he displayed so many credentials on his bronze plaque that nearby doctors complained to the medical association. Just like before, Petiot built a loyal client base. In fact, in 1944, over 2,000 of his patients were interviewed, and not one had anything bad to say about him. However, whispers circulated that he was involved in illegal abortions and overprescribing narcotics to create drug addicts. In 1934, a 30-year-old woman named Roald Hans came to Petiot to have a dental abscess drained. He drove her home while she was still unconscious from the anesthetic, and she tragically died a few hours later. Horrified by what happened, Hans's mother demanded an autopsy. The results showed high levels of morphine in her blood. Even though the coroner postponed the burial for an investigation, Authorities believed in the popular Dr. Petiot, and the case was closed without any charges. In 1942, there was an attempt to reopen the case, but it was denied. By 1936, Petiot was appointed as médecin de santé for the 9th arrondissement of Paris. While this role held little authority, it allowed him to officially sign death certificates, a position he exploited for his own benefit. In April 1936, Petiot was caught red-handed trying to steal a book. Instead of returning it to the store employee, he violently assaulted the worker, threatened him with murder, and even attacked a police officer before fleeing on foot. He turned himself in 2 days later, presenting his military discharge papers as proof that he wasn't responsible for his actions. The charges were quickly dropped due to claims of insanity, and Petiot's wife, Jette, arranged for him to go to a private sanatorium for rest and recovery. However, upon entering the hospital in August, Petiot fell to his knees almost immediately, crying and begging to be released. He insisted that his madness had passed and claimed it was just a temporary episode caused by his obsession with a new suction machine he believed would help with constipation. One doctor noted that Petiot was chronically unbalanced, describing him as a morally unscrupulous and emotionally unstable liar. Despite these harsh assessments, the doctor eventually recommended that Petiot be released. In September 1936, the court delayed his release by ordering evaluations from 3 additional psychiatrists. Although they expressed doubts about his honesty during this ordeal, there were no legal grounds to keep him locked up. He was finally released in February 1937. Aside from consistently committing tax fraud, reporting less than 10% of his actual earnings between 1937 and 1940, Petiot seemed to clean up his act somewhat after getting out. However, these fraudulent activities led to more charges against him. Otherwise, he managed to keep things in order until the world changed dramatically with Germany's invasion of Poland, marking the start of World War II. In September 1939, just after World War II began, France suffered a devastating defeat by Germany in June 1940. Paris was declared an open city and taken over by German troops, leading to the creation of a collaborationist government in Vichy, located in southern France, while the north remained under German control. On June 22nd, around 42,000 French soldiers surrendered to the Nazis. Initially, a small group fled from northern France in a mass exodus to the south where the Vichy government had been formed. As the occupation continued, more French patriots rose up to form the resistance. Anyone suspected of being linked to the resistance faced execution, forcing these groups to operate underground and create escape routes for those wanted by the Germans or the Vichy government. Dr. Marcel Petiot saw a chance to profit by supplying fake medical disability certificates to individuals being drafted for forced labor in Germany. He also treated sick and wounded workers when they returned, gathering intelligence on the Nazis from those who had first-hand experience. At the same time, Petiot bragged about secret inventions he claimed could eliminate Nazis without leaving any evidence behind, saying he had set booby traps all over Paris. However, no one ever confirmed these stories. In 1940, Petiot created a fake operation called Fly Talks, claiming it was an escape network he ran under the alias Dr. Own. He spun this tale during a visit to a barber named Rul Fourier, saying that for a fee of 25,000 francs, he could arrange passage to Argentina via Portugal for anyone trying to avoid capture. Petiot told Fourier that his network was called Fly Talks, borrowing names from products visible in the barbershop. Fly Talks was a popular insecticide and Own was a well-known male hair care brand. It was clear that Petiot had simply stolen these names. While plotting his sinister scheme in the barbershop, Rul Fourier agreed to pass on names of potential clients to Petiot in exchange for a small cut of the profits. Petiot advised the escapees to gather their valuables, cash, and jewelry to ensure they had some money when they reached Argentina. He told them to remove any name tags from their clothing, not to tell anyone where they were going, and to travel very light. Essentially, Petiot was asking his victims to prepare perfectly for him. In May 1941, Petiot bought the now infamous house at 21 Rue, telling construction workers it would be a clinic and mental institution. In truth, it would become his death chamber. He built high walls around the property, claiming they were for patient privacy, but they actually hid his true activities from the outside world. Once inside the townhouse, Petiot would tell his victims that Argentinian border security required all entrants to be vaccinated against diseases, and that he could provide the necessary shots in his office at the back of the house. After he closed the front door behind them, they would never be seen alive again. Petiot was actually poisoning these individuals with cyanide, a deadly chemical that prevents cells from using oxygen, leading to a complete shutdown of the body. Everything about Petiot's murders was carefully planned and clinical, leaving little mess behind. It is believed he killed as a means to an end. It was efficient and brought him financial gain. No one would ever report these individuals missing after visiting Petiot because they were all trying to escape the law. Petiot's early clientele included two men from Paris, Joseph Roux and Adrien Estate, who were on the run from both the Gestapo and French police after pretending to be Gestapo agents during an armed robbery. In September 1942, Joseph Roux, his mistress Claudia Chamoux, and others like François Albertini and Annette Bassett vanished after entering 21 Rue. Among his known victims were the Nella family, 3 German Jews found in the Seine, Petiot's preferred method of disposal, as well as the Wolf family, who disappeared along with 6 friends after knocking on the door of 21 Rue. Another man, Joseph Paisy, also disappeared with his girlfriend, Poet Key. In 1942 and 1943, numerous dismembered bodies were pulled from the river, including 9 heads and various other mutilated body parts. Both French and German police were baffled by these cases, as coroners struggled to identify the remains due to significant decomposition caused by being submerged in water. Petiot's method of disposing of bodies involved quicklime or calcium oxide, which prevents the spread of disease and masks odors. When quicklime touches a dead body, it absorbs moisture and creates heat that kills bacteria while drying out the body. Medical examiners noted specific mutilations on each body. Every head had a shaved scalp with eyebrows removed, and fingerprints had been destroyed by acid or filing. These details showed a careful effort to hide identities. The most alarming aspect of the bodies was the tiny incision marks left in the thighs, resembling a scalpel inserted directly into the flesh like a pin in a pin cushion. This technique was common practice for medical doctors at the time. Instead of placing a scalpel on a surface, coroners or medics would use the flesh of the thighs to hold the blade, avoiding exposure to an open blade. A doctor examining the body parts retrieved from the Seine would surely recognize these marks as a scalpel preservation technique taught in medical residency programs. Petiot's skills with a scalpel and larger blades, along with his medical knowledge, helped him cover his tracks, especially since he discarded body parts in mismatched batches. However, this precision also led authorities to suspect that the murderer was a doctor by profession. Despite these findings, it was actually the gendarmerie that uncovered Dr. Owen's fly talk network. In April 1943, gendarmerie officers reported widespread rumors about an organization arranging secret crossings of the Spanish border using fake Argentinian passports. Unbeknownst to them, the victims never left Paris. A French Jew named Ivan Rouse was blackmailed by gendarmerie officers into infiltrating the fly talk network but disappeared after contacting Petiot. Another informant provided names to Gestapo officers, leading to the arrest of Rul Fourier, the barber, and 2 other men, Edmond Pant and René Gustave Niais. The 3 men were tortured by the Nazis and quickly revealed everything they knew about the mysterious Dr. Owen, who was later arrested and joined them in prison. Miraculously, despite Nazi officers searching his home and interrogating his wife, they remained unaware of the House of Horrors at 21 Rue for 8 months. During this time, Petiot endured brutal torture at the hands of Gestapo officers while being pressed for information about the French resistance. Rather than confessing, he maintained his cover story as a helpful doctor playing his part in the resistance. Some of the torture methods used against Petiot included filing his teeth, relentless beatings, and crushing his head between iron plates. Yet, he continued to taunt and mock the Germans at every chance he got. Fellow inmates, who were true members of the resistance, described Petiot as the bravest person they had ever met, unaware that it is extremely difficult to torture a psychopath. Psychopaths do not react to punishment like other prisoners do. After 8 months in prison, Petiot and 2 other informants were released in January 1944. Instead of fleeing or hiding, Petiot went straight back to his house at 21 Rue to dispose of the body parts scattered around the basement. He asked his brother Maurice to bring him 700 kilograms of quicklime and began burning the bodies in the furnace. Strangely, rather than stay to finish the job, Petiot left while the flesh was still burning. Psychologists suggest he may have done this out of boredom. He had completed the parts of the job that benefited him and lost interest in disposing of the bodies. On March 6, 1944, thick black smoke began pouring from the chimney of 21 Rue. The smoke alarmed neighbors, especially because it smelled like burning rubber. After 5 days of thickening smoke, neighbors called the police to complain. 2 officers arrived on bicycles and spoke with the neighbor who made the call. The neighbor informed them that the house belonged to Dr. Marcel Petiot. After ringing the doorbell and knocking for several minutes without a response, the policeman found a note on the door that read, "Away for 1 month. Forward mail to 18. The neighbors reported seeing a strange series of visitors at the empty house over the past 6 months, including a man with a horse cart. They also mentioned that a few months earlier, 2 trucks had collected 47 suitcases and delivered 30 to 40 sacks. The neighbors noted that Dr. Petiot owned a second property 2 miles away at 66 Rue. The police then called his home address. When Petiot answered and asked if they had entered his house, they replied no. He responded, "Don't do anything. I'll be there in 15 minutes. After abruptly hanging up, Petiot was still nowhere to be found 30 minutes later, and the smoke continued to worsen. The police decided to call the firefighters. When they arrived, they entered the property through a second-story window and made their way to the basement. The firefighters soon spilled out of the front door, one of them violently retching as he did so. The chief informed the police, "You have some work ahead of you." Upon entering the home, officers first found what looked like a doctor's examination room. Next to it was a smaller triangular-shaped room that could only be accessed from the outside. On one wall were large iron rings, clearly used to restrain people. Opposite these rings was a peephole embedded in the wall, which, when viewed from the examination room, pointed directly at the iron rings. Petiot had evidently secured victims to these rings and watched them die in this small torture chamber. The officers then proceeded downstairs to the basement, where they discovered a coal stove with a human arm sticking out of the open door. Next to the furnace lay a pile of coal mixed with human bones and other dismembered body parts. Shocked and unable to determine how many victims they had just uncovered, the police were approached by a man on a bicycle who claimed to be the homeowner's brother. After confirming that the officers were French, he revealed in hushed tones that he was a resistance leader and insisted that the bodies inside belonged only to Germans and French traders, appealing to their patriotic sentiments against the Nazi regime. As Petiot's story began to sway some of the officers, they continued their search of the House of Horrors, uncovering grisly scene after grisly scene. In the garage, they found a heap of quicklime mixed with human remains, including a jawbone and some scalp. On the stairs leading from the courtyard to the basement, they discovered a large canvas sack containing the left half of a headless along with vital organs and a foot. In the stable, police uncovered a giant pit filled with more quicklime and decomposing corpses. Coroner Albert Paul identified the remains of at least 10 victims, but noted that this number did not accurately reflect the true death toll. Alongside identifiable bones and parts, he recorded 33 pounds of charred bones, 24 pounds of unburned fragments, 11 pounds of human hair, more than 10 whole scalps, and 3 bin bags filled with parts too small to identify. He recognized the same tiny scalpel marks and other signs indicating a medical professional's involvement, similar to those found on bodies recovered from the Seine. As Commissioner George Victor Massou searched the house, a telegram arrived from police headquarters in Paris ordering the arrest of Petiot, labeled a dangerous lunatic. The Germans' concern for Petiot only reinforced his narrative as a hero of the resistance. However, Commissioner Massou understood that this was a facade. He was truly a monster. Unfortunately, it was too late. They had allowed him to escape. When they went to his other property at 66 Rue, both Petiot and his wife had already fled. Petiot would remain at large for another 7 months after D-Day. In August 1944, amid a surge of enlistments in the resistance across France, Many who had previously shown little solidarity or had betrayed their neighbors were eager to demonstrate their unity against German occupation. Bridges were destroyed to hinder German troop movements, barricades were erected, and the Vichy government was dismantled. The French forces of the Interior FFI was formed to combat the remaining German forces in France. During this time, Marcel Petiot joined the resistance under the alias HRI Valéry and quickly rose to the rank of captain in charge of counterespionage and prisoner interrogation in Paris. A month later, Paris was liberated, and the FFI began hunting down collaborators left in the city. While French police believed Petiot had fled, he remained right under their noses, staying one step ahead, or so he thought. By this point, law enforcement was aware that Petiot was a serial killer and was eager to apprehend him. They received numerous reports from worried friends whose loved ones had gone to visit Petiot in hopes of escaping France but never returned. The police compiled an ever-growing list of names believed to be Petiot's victims and devised an urgent plan to capture him. The detective leading the manhunt for Petiot published an article in the newspaper Resistance, exposing him as a Nazi collaborator and labeling him a soldier of the Reich. The article alleged that he had worn a German uniform to round up French patriots in 1943. This story was designed to provoke Petiot into revealing his location, and it succeeded. Petiot responded with a scathing letter denouncing the article as filthy lies, confirming to authorities that he was still in Paris. At 10:15 a.m. on October 31, 1944, Petiot was recognized as he entered a metro station in Paris. 3 military officers approached him and asked for the time. As he raised his arm to check his watch, they pounced. One officer handcuffed him while another kicked him to the ground to prevent his escape. Petiot was found carrying a pistol, 31,700 francs in cash, and 50 different identity documents under 6 different names. He was held in jail for a year due to significant events unfolding across Europe at that time. However, when his trial began, it dominated the headlines. Petiot announced publicly that he intended to have fun with this trial. He claimed innocence, stating that he had killed enemies of France while working as a resistance member and had only learned about the bodies at 21 Rue after being released from Nazi custody, assuming they were dumped by his disbanded Fly Talk network. Prosecutors completely dismissed his claims, having found no evidence to support his story. They charged him with 27 counts and for stealing 200 million francs in cash, gold, and jewels. Thus began Petiot's trial. On March 18, 1946, at the Palais de Justice, 3 judges and a 7-man jury were present as 49 suitcases retrieved from Petiot's property were stacked next to the jury, highlighting the severity of his crimes. These suitcases were believed to belong to his victims. Prosecutors were supported by 12 civil lawyers, whom Petiot eagerly confronted from the stand. He played a significant role in his own defense, frequently interrogating witnesses and joking with the prosecutors. When asked why inspectors couldn't find the victims he claimed were alive and well in South America, Petiot smiled and replied, "South America is a big place." He refused to describe his weapons and provided explanations for why each of his victims was not actually a victim. Typical of psychopaths, Petiot's lies were so pathological that it was challenging to catch him. He could easily evade questions and fabricate new stories. At one point, when the judge expressed frustration over Petiot doodling in court, he retorted, "I am listening, but it doesn't really interest me very much." After the second day of the trial, 2 jurors referred to Petiot as a demon and an appalling murderer. While his lawyers demanded a mistrial, those 2 jurors were simply replaced. The story of a well-respected doctor turned serial killer captivated the press, with many following the case closely in disbelief at how he had managed to evade capture for so long while brutally killing innocent people seeking a better life. Public anger and disgust grew, leading to Petiot being dubbed Dr. Satan by the media on the 5th day of the trial. All judges and jurors visited the property at 21 Rue, where neighbors and police shouted at Petiot as he quipped, "Peculiar homecoming, don't you think?" Throughout the proceedings, Petiot maintained his innocence, admitting to killing 19 of the 27 victims identified at the house but claiming they were all Germans and collaborators. He asserted that these individuals were part of the 63 enemies of France he had killed between 1940 and 1945, refusing to identify the other 44 victims, stating, "I don't have to justify myself, I'm not accused of committing." His defense attorney framed Petiot as a hero of the resistance, but the judges and jury were not convinced. After a 3-hour deliberation, they found him guilty on all but 9 of the 135 criminal charges. Petiot was sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, he smiled and asked, "When are they going to assassinate me?" He declined the option to see a priest before his execution, insisting he wanted to take his baggage with him. Following a brief postponement due to a guillotine malfunction, a portable guillotine was delivered to the prison at 3:30 a.m. on May 25, 1946. An hour later, Dr. Petiot refused a glass of rum but accepted a cigarette. He ultimately agreed to meet with the prison chaplain for his wife's sake, stating, "I am not a religious man, and my conscience is clean." Witnesses noted that Petiot appeared at ease, as if walking into his office for a routine appointment. With his hands tied and neck shaved, he was strapped to the table. Turning to the audience, he said, "Gentlemen, I ask you not to look. This will not be very pretty." The guillotine blade dropped at 5:05 a.m., and according to those present, Petiot had a big smile on his face as his head fell to the ground. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to discover that the person who once vowed to love you is now plotting your murder? In the quiet suburbs of a peaceful neighborhood, Susan's story begins not with the violent clash of a hammer against flesh, but with something far more insidious, a handwritten note from her ex-husband Mike. "Sue, haven't been sleeping. Had to get away. Went to the beach. Just losing it. Don't know what to do. Love me." These words, scrawled on paper and left on her kitchen table, would later reveal themselves as the prelude to an orchestrated attempt on her life. That morning, as Susan stepped into her home, the familiar beep of her security system offered a false sense of safety. The shadows in her bedroom seemed longer than usual, the morning sunlight conspicuously absent. But it wasn't until she crossed the threshold of her bedroom that the true horror of Mike's manipulation came to light. There, lurking behind her door, stood Ed, a stranger in yellow rubber gloves, wielding a claw hammer with deadly intent. What followed was a 14-minute battle for survival that would expose the darkest depths of betrayal. As Susan fought for her life against a hired killer, she couldn't have known that the real architect of her intended death was the same man who had left that seemingly troubled note. The man who had once shared her bed, her dreams, and her trust. This is not just a story of survival against a violent intruder. It's a chilling testament to how quickly love can turn to malice, and how the bonds of marriage can transform into chains of betrayal. Susan's tale forces us to question, how well do we really know the people we let into our lives? And what happens when the greatest threat comes not from a stranger, but from the person we once called beloved? In emergency room of Providence Portland Medical Center in 1988, a dedicated nurse named Susan was immersed in her work. With her stethoscope draped around her neck, she moved swiftly from patient to patient, delivering medications and discussing care plans with doctors. At 33 years old, Susan thrived in the fast-paced environment, finding joy in helping others. Yet, deep inside, she felt a stirring desire for something more. A chance to find love and adventure outside the walls of the hospital. One evening, after another long shift, Susan decided to take a bold step. She picked up a pen and wrote a personal ad for the local newspaper. This was the 1988 version of Swiping Right. In her ad, she described herself as a single white female, 33, overweight but not over life, inviting anyone who shared her zest for life and love for exploring the beautiful Northwest to reach out. Much to her surprise, Susan received a response from a man named Mike Cousin. When she met him, he wasn't exactly what she had imagined. He was stocky with a beard and long sandy hair, wearing oversized glasses that made him look a bit quirky. But as they spent time together, Susan discovered that Mike shared her interests and had a passion for nature and beach outings. They laughed and explored together, and Susan found herself enchanted by his adventurous spirit. However, beneath Mike's charming exterior lay shadows from his past. He was divorced and had 2 children from that marriage. While this didn't deter Susan, Mike's bitterness about his divorce began to seep into their relationship. He viewed his failed marriage as a mark of shame and harbored resentment towards his ex-wife, believing that his ex-wife had taken advantage of him financially. This lingering bitterness raised some warning signs for Susan, though they weren't outright red flags, just things to keep an eye on. Despite these concerns, Susan remained optimistic. Having witnessed countless miraculous recoveries in her emergency room career, she believed that Mike could overcome his struggles too. On December 11, 1988, in a moment filled with hope and love, Susan became Mrs. Cowson. In the early years of their marriage, life seemed bright. They shared countless adventures, from birdwatching to butterfly spotting, and even enjoyed a beautiful trip along the Oregon coast, where the waves crashed joyfully against the shore. But every so often, those warning signs Susan had noticed began to creep back into their lives. Mike's negativity would bubble to the surface, especially when things didn't go as he wished. He often felt like the world was conspiring against him, and his obsession with money grew stronger. This fixation on finances became the first real red flag for Susan. She cherished experiences and relationships far more than material possessions, preferring to spend her hard-earned money on meaningful moments rather than things. In stark contrast, Mike placed immense value on wealth and material items. For instance, while he criticized Susan for spending money on a simple movie outing, he was secretly investing large sums into a collection of sports memorabilia, old baseball cards, jerseys, and autographed gloves that he believed would one day be worth a fortune. Susan felt uneasy about his delusions surrounding this collection. What troubled her even more was how much time Mike spent locked away in the basement obsessing over it. He seemed to be withdrawing from the world around him, transforming into someone she hardly recognized. The adventurous man she had fallen in love with during their nature explorations was fading away. This isolation didn't seem healthy for either him or their marriage, and it left Susan feeling increasingly worried about their future together. Susan felt a growing unease as she tried to talk to Mike about her concerns. She noticed him pulling away and gently asked what was wrong. When he seemed hesitant to open up, she suggested he see a therapist for help. But Mike stubbornly refused to admit anything was wrong with him, instead finding faults in everyone else around him. This tendency to blame others for his problems made it increasingly difficult for Susan to be near him. If Mike was angry, it was always someone else's fault. If Susan felt unhappy, he dismissed her feelings as mere nagging. Rather than push the issue further, Susan decided to let it go and focus on what she could control. She accepted Mike's new interests and tried to show her love and support, encouraging him to get out more and spend time with her and her friends. She held on to the hope that with the right care, he would heal and return to the man she had once fallen in love with. For 17 long years, she nurtured that hope. Sadly, as time passed, Mike's behavior took a darker turn. He began to grow suspicious of Susan, convinced that, like his ex-wife, she would leave him and take all their money. It didn't matter that most of their income came from Susan's job as a nurse. Mike had various odd jobs but rarely earned as much as she did. This financial disparity may have fueled his insecurity and bitterness. Mike felt cheated out of a fair chance at life. Although they rarely discussed it, he had served in Vietnam and opened up about his experiences only once during their entire marriage. Those memories haunted him, perhaps adding to the weight of his anger and distrust. As Susan watched the man she loved transform into someone consumed by suspicion and resentment, her heart ached for the connection they once shared. On one fateful day, Mike finally opened up to Susan about his haunting experiences in Vietnam. He shared stories of long-range patrols and recounted a day when his team was ordered to attack a village, believing it was filled with enemies. But when they arrived, Mike was faced with a heartbreaking sight: children playing innocently. He never revealed what happened next, but Susan could see the pain in his eyes. It still haunted him deeply. Concerned for his well-being, she suggested he talk to someone at the vet center or veteran affairs, fearing he might have PTSD. Yet, Mike stubbornly refused, insisting he didn't need therapy because he had his own way of dealing with those painful memories. He claimed he would simply lock them away in a room and throw away the key. From her experience as a nurse, Susan knew that this approach wouldn't truly help him. By 2005, after 16 years of trying to make their marriage work, she felt she was reaching the end of her rope. Mike seemed unwilling to put in the effort to heal. He continued to withdraw and rejected her attempts to support him. His increasing anger worried her even more. His outbursts seemed to erupt out of nowhere and often targeted Susan. Fearing they were heading toward domestic violence, Susan decided it was time for a change. Around the holidays, she told Mike he needed to move out, and he complied. For the first time in years, Susan felt a wave of relief wash over her. She could finally breathe again. Although she had asked him to leave, she hadn't entirely given up on him. She didn't necessarily want to reconcile, but hoped they could avoid an ugly divorce. She continued to reach out to Mike, inviting him to friendly gatherings and even trusting him with the code to her home security system, now her home alone. Despite everything, a flicker of hope remained in her heart that perhaps one day they could find peace. The alarm code for Susan's home had always been a reminder of their love. Their anniversary, December 11th, 88. Even after asking Mike to leave, she didn't change it, holding on to the hope that distance would allow him to heal. Unfortunately, that hope was misplaced. Mike managed to put on a convincing front, appearing fine and trustworthy to Susan. But when he was alone, a storm of rage brewed inside him. He felt like a failure in marriage for the second time, directing his anger at Susan just as he had at his first wife. As time passed, Mike became increasingly convinced that Susan had kicked him out to sabotage him during the divorce. Determined not to let that happen again, he twisted his thoughts into a dark plan. The only way to avoid losing face, money, and his beloved sports memorabilia collection was to murder Susan before she could finalize their divorce. This chilling mindset stemmed from his fears about finances rather than any genuine concern for their relationship. To him, it didn't matter if she found happiness with someone else. All he could think about was what he stood to lose. Living in a victim mindset, Mike felt justified in his sinister thoughts. After months of separation, he began plotting how he would kill Susan before she could finalize their divorce. Having likely faced violence before in combat, he may not have hesitated at the thought of committing such an act against her. The darkness within him grew stronger, and with each passing day, the line between right and wrong blurred further in his mind. Mike knew that if Susan turned up dead, the police would look at him first. They were in the middle of a divorce, and since she made more money than he did, he had to be clever about his plan. For a while, he considered making it look like an accident. He repeatedly invited Susan to the beach, hoping she might fall off a cliff, but she always declined. Desperate for a new strategy, Mike's story took an unexpected turn. He worked as the maintenance supervisor for a chain of adult novelty stores called Fantasy Adult Video. Part of his job involved hiring and firing custodial staff. One day, a man recently released from prison came in to apply for a cleaning position. This man, Ed Hay, casually mentioned that he had been incarcerated for conspiracy to commit murder. Mike must have felt stunned. It seemed like fate had dropped an opportunity right into his lap. After hiring Ed, he learned even more about him. Ed had served 10 years for hiring a hitman to torture and murder his ex-girlfriend. He also had prior convictions for robbery and assault and struggled with an addiction to crack cocaine. While not the kind of person you'd want working for your business, he was exactly the type of person Mike could consider for a dirty job. Quickly, Mike struck up a friendship with Ed. He went out of his way to get close to him, discovering they shared common ground. Both had served in the military and felt like the world was against them. They were both narcissists who blamed others for their problems. With their negativity feeding off each other, it didn't take long for Mike to open up and share his dark thoughts with Ed. They found themselves openly discussing their desire to murder someone, revealing just how far Mike was willing to go to protect himself from losing everything he held dear. Mike confided in Ed about his belief that Susan was planning to screw him over in their divorce. He expressed his determination not to be the victim this time. In a moment of desperation, he offered Ed a staggering $50,000 to murder Susan, claiming it was much more than others might pay. Ed reacted with skepticism, saying he wouldn't do it for that amount, but Mike insisted he was serious. He proposed paying half up front and half upon completion. Ed, having been down this road before, might have wondered where Mike would get such money. As it turned out, Mike's job as a maintenance supervisor at the adult novelty store paid well. In addition to his salary and benefits, he received a holiday bonus of $4,000 or $5,000 each year. When he brought it home, he told Susan he only got $1,000 and contributed that to their joint account while hiding the rest. This deception allowed Mike to save a significant amount, enough to give Ed the upfront payment of $25,000 and promise another $25,000 upon completion of the job. Ed agreed, and just like that, Mike's sinister plan was in motion. On September 6, 2006, Mike drove Ed to the home where Susan now lived alone in southeast Portland. He let Ed into the house using the alarm code from their anniversary. Then he reset the alarm to bypass mode, allowing Ed to move around inside while the system remained armed. Before leaving, Mike placed a note for Susan in the mudroom and checked into a motel room by the beach to set up an alibi. He waited there for Ed to call and tell him it was done. Meanwhile, Susan was hard at work at Providence Medical Center. After a long 9-hour shift in the ER, she headed home, completely unaware of the danger lurking within her own walls. Trusting Mike completely, she kept the alarm code the same and gave him the benefit of the doubt throughout their troubled relationship. It must have been incredibly confusing and heartbreaking for Susan to learn that someone she loved was trying to kill her. As she walked into her home, the familiar beep of the security system signaled that it was armed. She turned off the alarm and then noticed Mike's note. Earlier that day, he had called to say he was going to the beach, so she felt puzzled but not entirely surprised by the note he left. Sue, haven't been sleeping. Had to get away. Went to the beach. Just losing it. Don't know what to do. Love me. With a pang of sympathy for her ex, she set the note aside and headed to her bedroom to change. As she walked down the hallway, an uneasy feeling washed over her. The bedroom was dark, which was strange because Susan always opened the curtains in the morning to let in light. She wondered if she had simply forgotten that day. Shrugging off her discomfort, she continued into the bedroom. Suddenly, a man stepped out from behind the door. It was Ed, but Susan had no idea who he was. All she saw was a scraggly-looking man wearing yellow rubber gloves and holding a claw hammer. Reacting on instinct, she blurted out, "Who are you? What are you doing here? What do you want?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he swung the hammer at her head, striking her on the temple. At 51 years old, Susan fought back fiercely, wrestling with what she assumed was a burglar. She shoved him against the wall, desperately trying to wrestle the hammer away from him. Throughout the struggle, Susan expected him to demand jewelry or ask for the safe code, but he didn't say anything at all. As they grappled, doubt crept into her mind. Was this man really a burglar? She fought for her life while her thoughts raced in confusion about who he was and why he was there. Eventually, using all her strength, she managed to pin him against the wall. In that moment, their eyes locked, and he uttered the only words he spoke during this entire terrifying encounter. "You're strong." When Ed told Susan, "You're strong," it felt both creepy and unsettling. Here he was, trying to kill her, yet surprised by her fierce resistance. Susan sensed his twisted excitement, which only made her stomach churn as she realized he was there to end her life. In that moment, a fierce determination surged within her. She thought, "You are not going to kill me in my own home." All the anger she had suppressed during her marriage came rushing back, fueling her fight for survival. With a sudden burst of strength, Susan wrapped her hands around Ed's throat, still gripping the hammer he had used against her. She squeezed tightly as he struggled against her grip, but she held firm, using her weight to pin him against the wall. As his face began to turn blue and he gasped for air, she felt an empowering rush. Finally, Ed released his grip on the hammer. Seizing the opportunity, Susan let go of his neck and grabbed the weapon for herself. She remembered something her father had taught her. If anyone broke into their home, she could defend herself with a hammer. He had advised using the claw end for maximum effectiveness. With that knowledge in mind, Susan flipped the hammer and began striking Ed with it. Her father's advice proved invaluable. It was an effective weapon. However, after a few desperate strikes, The hammer slipped from her hand due to the fear and adrenaline coursing through her. Instead of picking it up again, she decided to escape. She turned and ran, screaming for her neighbors to call 911. Ed, injured but determined not to go to prison for attempted murder, chased after her. He caught up with her in the hallway and grabbed her from behind, spinning her around and starting to punch her in the face. By this point, their struggle felt like it had lasted longer than a UFC match. Both were utterly exhausted. Susan fell to the floor, drained of strength and only a few feet away from the phone. She thought there was no way she could reach it. Hearing footsteps behind her on the hardwood floor, she looked back to see Ed standing over her again. He still wore those rubber gloves and had retrieved the hammer. As he raised it to deliver what could be a fatal blow, Susan felt another surge of rage and adrenaline flood through her. He is not going to kill me, she thought fiercely. In a desperate move, Susan lunged for Ed's legs, grabbing his calves and yanking his feet out from under him. He fell to the floor, and they wrestled fiercely for control of the hammer. Susan screamed until her voice was hoarse, but no one came to help. Where were the neighbors? Amidst the chaos, she decided to fight back even harder. Thinking that if he killed her, her bite marks and saliva could identify him, she bit Ed several times on the arms and thighs, targeting areas that would hurt. But despite her efforts, he still wouldn't let go of the hammer. Just when Susan thought she might never regain control of the weapon, she had another idea. With one last surge of strength, she managed to get Ed onto his stomach. Climbing onto him, she wrapped her arms around his neck in a chokehold. This tactic had worked for her before, and Ed began thrashing wildly beneath her. As she choked him from behind, she pleaded, "Tell me who you are, and I will call you an ambulance." But Ed never responded. After a few agonizing minutes, he slumped down motionless. Susan staggered to her feet, grabbed the hammer, and ran with all her remaining strength through her neighbor's house. 14 minutes had passed since the attack began. A long struggle for survival against a grown man with a hammer. She waited on her neighbor's porch as police and paramedics arrived. Despite her exhaustion, adrenaline surged through her veins, keeping her alert. When a police officer approached her, she asked if the man who had attacked her was dead. The officer confirmed it. Susan took this in but was suddenly flooded with emotion. Not relief as one might expect, but deep grief. She hadn't woken up that day planning to kill someone. Even while fighting for her life, she felt a profound sorrow for Ed. She thought about how he probably had a family of his own and how things could have turned out so differently if only he had chosen another path. Susan believed that everyone has someone in the world who loves them, and she was sure this man was no different. Someone would soon be mourning for him. Yet, she had no idea who he was or what he wanted, though she had a pretty good idea of who had sent him. As she distanced herself from the attack, it struck her that this man had entered her home while the security system was armed. There was only one person who could disarm it and then rearm it to allow him inside. Someone she had once loved. Mike had been on vacation, or whatever you might call it, while Ed waited for hours to hear from him about how the job had gone. Still at the motel by the beach, Mike eventually turned on the TV and was shocked to see his house on the news. It was clear something terrible had happened, but the reporters weren't providing enough details. Mike wondered if Susan had been found dead or if Ed had completed his mission. To find out, he called Providence Medical Center, where Susan worked, asking if she was there. The staff replied that they didn't know. The truth was that Susan was indeed there, as a patient in the same emergency room where she worked. Fearing that Mike might come for her again, she had instructed everyone not to reveal her presence. Meanwhile, Mike remained oblivious to what was happening. In his frustration, he tried calling Susan's friends and eventually reached a woman named Helen. Helen had known Susan for many years and harbored serious concerns about Mike. So much so that when Mike tried to take Susan to the beach, Helen warned her not to be alone with him because they were separated and his intentions were unclear. Helen's instincts about Mike were strong, and now they weighed heavily on her mind as she worried about her friend's safety in light of recent events. Receiving a call from Mike at almost 2 o'clock in the morning made Helen feel uneasy. She listened warily as Mike babbled, sounding almost manic. He repeated over and over, "I was at the beach. I've been at the beach. I was in a motel at the beach, and I saw the house on the news. I can't reach Susan. Do you know what's going on? Helen told Mike she didn't know what was happening and hung up. However, she became convinced that Mike knew more than he let on. If he was at the beach, why not just drive to his house to see what was going on? The next day, Helen accompanied Susan back to her house after she was released from the hospital. Although it was still a crime scene, police allowed her to pick up a few personal items. While there, Helen noticed something unusual. Mike's sports memorabilia collection was boxed up by the door. It appeared that the hitman was supposed to take it and give it to Mike, making it look like a burglary gone wrong. As Helen continued to look around, she spotted a backpack that seemed out of place, and Susan confirmed it wasn't hers. Police officers opened it up and found a day planner belonging to Ed, the now-dead hitman. This discovery helped them identify him. He had left his backpack behind, likely intending to take it when he left but never had the chance. Inside the day planner, they found a note dated September 4th, just 2 days before the attack, that read, "Call Mike." They also discovered Mike's cell phone number scrawled inside one of the folders. This must have been a devastating blow for Susan. She had suspected Mike's involvement, but now had undeniable proof that the man she had invested 17 years of her life in wanted her dead. The police were convinced and prepared to arrest Mike, charging him with conspiracy to commit murder. At this point, nobody knew where he was, but Susan had a good idea. The beach had always been a refuge for Mike, a place where he could clear his head. However, as hours passed and the reality of his failed plans set in, Mike realized he probably couldn't go home anymore. If his plan had failed and Ed was dead, he knew he had made a grave mistake that could cost him everything. Ed, the hitman, had made a critical mistake that exposed Mike. Leaving a note that pointed police directly to him, Mike went on the run for several days, trying to devise a plan. Luckily for Susan, Mike was spotted before he could make his next move. On September 15, 2006, just days after the attempted murder, he was arrested. He insisted he was innocent and told police he was suicidal. Mike's daughter from his first marriage claimed he had left a suicide note, but whether it was real or just another ploy like the note he left for Susan didn't help his case. He was charged with conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, just like Ed had been over 10 years earlier. In January 2007, his daughter managed to raise the money to get him released on house arrest. However, the landlord refused to let him stay there, so back to jail he went. This brought relief to Susan, who felt she was living with 2 life sentences. The pain of knowing Mike had tried to kill her, and the pain of having taken someone's life. During his September 2007 sentencing hearing, Susan addressed Mike directly. Looking into the eyes of the man she once loved, she said, "As long as you live, I will never have a measure of peace, but I will not be destroyed." While Mike was sentenced to 10 years in prison, Susan dedicated herself to helping others during that time. She became an outspoken advocate for victims of violent crime and started several organizations to assist them. She even created a website where people in her county could check the status of their cases and find information about offenders. The thought of someone hiring a hitman to kill her was terrifying. How could she be sure it wouldn't happen again? A restraining order wouldn't stop someone determined to harm her. In 2015, Susan learned that Mike would be released early. To protect herself, she changed her name and moved. As a victim who almost died, she had to change her identity, a devastating necessity for her safety. She took additional precautions by putting gravel outside her house so she could hear anyone approaching and installed security cameras. She even began taking lessons at a shooting range. Years later, Susan continued to grapple with the reality that she had been forced to take a life in self-defense. But Susan wasn't ashamed. She knew that if the need arose again, she would be ready. Fortunately, that moment never came because Mike died of prostate cancer just a few months before his early release. When she learned of her ex-husband's death, Susan expressed mixed feelings. She said, "I don't mourn his passing. Instead, I mourn the life he could have had if only he could have opened his heart to those of us who cared about him." Despite everything she had been through, Susan remained true to herself. She no longer loved her ex-husband when he died, but she would always wish she could have saved him. This is the story of Susan Cowson. It's unimaginable to think that someone you love could try to kill you.